From post-apocalyptic vampires to dragons, creepy houses, contemporary politics, and love stories, August definitely had a little bit of it all. Let's chat about the 9 books I read last month. So the first book that I read in August was a book that I wouldn't necessarily always gravitate towards this author in particular. I've read a few of her books, but she needs absolutely no introduction. I'm talking about Emily Henry, and I read her latest offering, which was Great Big Beautiful Life. And I actually felt quite interested in this one because a lot of criticisms about this book, and there have been a lot of them, have been about how it's not really a romance book. It reads more literary and there's a bit of mystery in it. And to be honest with you, those are things that actually appeal to me because, as I've mentioned, I'm not a great romance reader. I definitely err a lot toward literary or fantasy, which this book is obviously not. But I picked this one up particularly because of the criticisms. I thought, oh, maybe this might be the Emily Henry that I really, really love. But overall, I did come away with it with quite mixed feelings because this is a book that has probably almost a little bit too much going on. It definitely has Emily Henry's signature warmth and depth and wit and this kind of knack for creating these really lovely characters, and she's definitely lauded as one of the greats in terms of romance writing at the moment. This one in particular is about a young journalist, and she has the opportunity to potentially write the memoir for this really famous woman. This woman in particular has kind of disappeared and nobody's really known what happened to her. There's a lot of mystery surrounding her, but when our main character gets there, she realizes that she's actually up against another author who wrote like this really famous, well-lauded memoir, and it turns out that he is basically the love interest. So there's definitely romance in here, and there's definitely a little bit of mystery, and I definitely enjoyed the themes of like self-discovery and love, and of course the messiness of relationships. There were moments when the writing really did kind of hit me emotionally, and I found myself rooting for the characters overall. That said, it didn't fully land for me. The pacing was probably a little bit uneven, and some of it dragged, and then some of it felt like it moved maybe a little bit too fast. I probably did struggle a little bit with the central romance. While it was nice, I kind of didn't feel the chemistry all that much, which is fine. I'm not really reading a book for the romance, even though it is technically a romance book. This one definitely felt like Henry was trying to kind of meld together her signature warmth with something deeper than she might normally write, and I don't know how well that landed. Overall though, I did quite enjoy it, and I found it to be quite a pleasant read, but it's probably not a book that's going to stick with me long term, unfortunately. There's plenty in here to enjoy, but honestly, I think Henry has better books out there. And then the next book that I read in August is a book that I've been really looking forward to and was kind of keeping it for a day when I really wanted to indulge in it. And it's a very short book, and the book I'm talking about is The River Has Roots by Amal El-Motar. So this is sort of a fantastical book. We are primarily following 2 sisters who sort of are caretakers for these like magical trees. So this is very much a magical book. These girls are sort of in that time of life where they're expected to find husbands, and I won't go too much into the plot because it's quite short, and actually this book has another short story in it as well, so we don't want to give too much away. I liked this to some degree, but honestly, if I had my time back, I might not even bother reading it. This one didn't really land for me personally. I know there's a lot of praise for this book, but I felt that it was a bit meh. There was kind of nothing in here to really drag me in. It didn't feel that original, which is quite disappointing because I really loved This Is How You Lose the Time War, which was co-written by Amal El-Motar, and it just didn't quite land for me. Maybe my expectations were not quite what they should have been for this, and that could have let me down a bit. It just didn't feel all that original. It just felt like another sort of bizarre fairy tale that I ended up not loving, and it's a real shame. I do think that there's a lot about this book that people will enjoy. Like, the writing's really nice, it's really lyrical, it's quite a beautiful story in many ways, and it's quite dark also, but it didn't land. It just didn't land, and I was really disappointed because it's one that I had been anticipating for quite a long time. Can't win them all, I guess. The next book that I picked up in August then was a bit of a classic sort of dystopian sci-fi. I'm talking about I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So I have seen the film iteration of this story that starred Will Smith, and I quite enjoyed that, but I just never got around to reading the novel. Well, in August I did, pals, I did. And it's quite different from the film that I saw, to be honest. So we follow a man named, I think, Robert Neville, excuse me, and he is potentially the last person on Earth because every other man, woman and child has been infected with this virus or this bacteria or something or other, and they're all vampires. So by day Robert goes out and tries to scavenge what he can, and by night he stays in his house while the vampires pace outside trying to encourage him to come out so that they can feed on him. I can see why this story has been so influential. It's a mix of horror and science fiction, and the psychological tension is quite clever and quite well done, and the core idea is undeniably quite compelling as well. I think the isolation is portrayed quite well, and some of the more kind of quiet, unsettling moments really did work for me. That said, I will say that I think the pacing dragged in parts. The execution was a little bit uneven, and there was kind of a lot of science talk in here that I don't know, was it necessary, or am I just a bit silly and not able to understand what's going on? I can see why Matheson kind of wanted to make it seem realistic, but I don't know, I sort of believed the world building anyway. Still, it is quite powerful to some degree, and I liked how Matheson really subverted expectations with this one. It is an important book within its genre, but I think it's also a product of its time, and there definitely have been better sort of dystopian stories written since this one. That said, I'm glad I read it, and I do believe that it's worth the read. So this next book that I read in August felt really triumphant for me because it's the last book within a series that I've been reading since 2018 or 2019. So I've been on this series for a while, and I read the 7th book in this series. The series that I'm talking about is the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, and the 7th book in that series, of course, is the titular book, and it is called The Dark Tower. So I definitely expected this book to feel truly epic, to really wrap up and wind up what's been going on for a while. I find it difficult to describe what these books are about. They're essentially quest novels, but there's plenty elements of sci-fi and plenty elements of fantasy and real world things going on, and there's just a great mix of things going on. Sometimes I feel like Stephen King got very wordy, and throughout this series I have felt like there have been too many pages, there have been too many tangents, and I found it difficult to stay committed, and I think that's why it took me so long to read these books. There are some incredible highs within this book, in particular the intensity of the final trials and the emotional weight of certain character arcs, and honestly just the sheer scope of King's imagination. So I do think that this book had a lot going for it, and this series overall. But for me there are also plenty of frustrations. The pacing for me just drags so much at times in these books, and some of King's narrative choices felt really disjointed or even jarring. And the ending of this book, so the ending of this whole series, I can definitely see why it's divisive. I don't necessarily know how I feel about it myself. I didn't necessarily hate it, but I felt a little bit probably hollow about it, less satisfied than I would have expected. Overall, I definitely admire the ambition of this series. Like, it's huge in its scope, and what Stephen King does in this is incredible. So much happens within these books, and I'm glad that I saw it through. But for me, again, this final installment was a mixed bag, rewarding in parts and then frustrating in others, unfortunately. Really a middle of the road book for me, which is a shame. There is one more book within this series that I want to read. It works out to be book 4.5, and then I can put this series to bed and I'll keep it on my shelves, but to be honest with you, maybe they won't stay there forever. I respect them, but that's not enough for me to love a book. And the next book that I finished then was, I believe, the 12th book in a series. So obviously it's another Robin Hobb book. If you've been with me, you've been with Robin Hobb for a while. So I read City of Dragons, and this is the 3rd book within the Rainwild Chronicles and the 12th book within the overarching Realm of the Elderling series. So this book kind of just picks up where the last one left off. And because it is a sequel, I can't really go too much into detail what this book is about. It has all the hallmarks of Hobb's writing, so it's richly detailed. There's this slow burn storytelling. The characters are really well rounded. There's a lot going on. We cover quite a bit of a span of time, and we have this really immersive sense of place that I've really come to recognise as Robin Hobb's signature way of writing. I really enjoyed how the character arcs and the story arc deepened within this book, but it definitely does struggle a little bit with kind of middle book syndrome. I think it is a book about getting from A to Z, and unfortunately this part of the story isn't necessarily all that interesting. I did really enjoy how we come across facets from other books earlier in the series, sort of like little Easter eggs. That was interesting. And this book really saw some of the female characters sort of come into their own and stand up for themselves and really kind of grow into who they are and decide that what they want is okay. The pacing here is quite measured, and to say that it's potentially quite slow, which is saying something with Robin Hobb. There's a lot of focus on character development within this one and smaller interpersonal conflicts rather than huge big blowouts. And there aren't like huge dramatic plot turns as such within this one. At times it does feel a little bit like this story sort of was treading water, I suppose, so it sort of lost a little bit of its momentum. But that said, I feel like I've said so many negative things about this, but this is a Robin Hobb book. I really did enjoy it. It's just not the best in the series. Like, the series has been so high caliber so far that there had to have been a dip somewhere. It couldn't all maintain this really excellent quality. Just there has to be times where the pace slows a little to get from A to B or A to Z. Like, I definitely appreciated being back with these characters, and the themes of transformation and belonging and survival definitely kept me invested, and just the fact that it's Robin Hobb, of course I'm going to keep reading. It's not the strongest entry in the realm of the Elderlings by any means, but it's a solid continuation, and it sets the stage for what is to come in the conclusion of this quartet, which is Blood of Dragons. And then the next book that I read is a book that took me almost 4 months to finish. It's a non-fiction, and I do tend to struggle my way through non-fiction a little bit because there's not really any great plot, and I often find like it's the plot that compels me to keep reading a book. Anyway, the book that I'm talking about is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. So this book won the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction in 2024. It's sort of a really interesting concept. It's like part memoir, part cultural critique, and it's sort of part exploration of this strange political landscape we currently find ourselves in, including like online realities and just the current political scene overall. Naomi Klein uses this odd experience of constantly being mistaken for Naomi Wolf, and both women have very different politics, very different ideologies, and Naomi Klein doesn't quite enjoy being mistaken for Naomi Wolf for these reasons. She uses this as a starting point to dig into things like questions of identity and misinformation and conspiracy culture, and the way that digital life sort of fractures reality as well. I thought that the concept was quite fascinating, and Klein is probably really at her best when she's delving into these huge concepts and unpacking these huge systems. So this book deals with the rise of the far right, the rise of neoliberalism, and the ways that the internet really amplifies misinformation. Klein's analysis is incredibly sharp, and I came away from this book really feeling like I understood a lot of the concepts that I've been sort of milling around within my brain for such a long time that I haven't really properly conceptualized or critically thought about. This book was really great for that. She really manages to fix together and to connect all of these seemingly unconnected and disconnected cultural phenomena and how it all interlocks with each other. That said, this book did feel a little bit uneven at times. Sometimes I felt like the personal memoir bits didn't land, and the whole doppelganger metaphor was sometimes spread really thin to get her point across. It's an incredibly ambitious project, and fair play to Naomi Klein for writing this book. The blend of personal and political didn't necessarily always work perfectly for me, but I did really enjoy how in parts Klein sort of made me question my own beliefs. Even though I would have very similar politics to her, she made me sort of look at how I came to certain conclusions and how I cling to certain ideologies without really, thinking about them. I'm very liberal, very left wing, and sometimes I feel like well, my ideology is kindness, and I don't really allow for people to argue with how I feel about certain things, because I'm like, just let everybody live. But it is interesting how certain concepts were really delved into, and it certainly made me think. It's certainly an engaging and a thought-provoking read, and it captures really surreal and unsettling moments that we're just living in the midst of. If you're interested in politics and culture and media theory, this is a really excellent read. And next then, I read a domestic thriller by Irish author Andrea Mara. So it was my first Andrea Mara book, and my mom raves about her books. I was very much in the mood for something sort of creepy, twisty, turn your brain off. And this book really hit the mark for me in that regard. It really delves into this very primal fear. What if the noises you hear at night aren't just your house settling, but there's actually somebody in the house with you? This story follows a divorced couple who recently have moved from America back to Dublin, and they live quite in harmony with each other. They share an apartment and a house, so the kids stay in the house and then they do the all switcheroo depending on what time they're supposed to be with the kids. It's an unusual setup, but it works for them. And this particular house is in a really safe area, a gated estate that nobody can really get into or out of without a key or without access. But our protagonist, the woman, starts to really believe that there's somebody been coming into her house at night. There's been a spate of people making TikTok videos about breaking into people's houses and coming down through the attic and just recording themselves in other people's houses, not necessarily stealing anything or doing any harm, but just violating people's private spaces. Andrea Mara does this really great job of setting up this very bizarre, creepy atmosphere, and the early chapters really capture the creeping paranoia perfectly, and I found myself feeling quite unsettled at times. The pacing is quick and the chapters are short, and it's a real thriller. It just keeps you going, keeps the pages turning. Where the book did falter for me, though, unfortunately, was in some of the later reveals. It wasn't perfect. I kind of saw coming what was coming. There are definitely some red herrings thrown in here, and I was like, oh, I have it, and then I didn't, of course. I felt a little bit let down by the resolution, how that played out, juxtaposed with how enthralled I was by the setup. The characters didn't feel as fleshed out as maybe I would have liked, but I think this is something that I encounter with thrillers a lot, and for me then that does lessen the emotional punch of the ending. Overall, this book is like a fast, suspenseful read with a great hook, but it just didn't quite stick the landing for me. If you enjoy thrillers that play on domestic fears and keep you guessing, it is worth picking up. It's a very quick, easy read. I probably will read more from Andrea Mara. I have heard that this isn't necessarily her best work, so we'll see where she goes from here. And because we are coming into autumn now, I was very much in the mood for a book that felt quite lush and quite gothic. So on my Kindle, I had The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. So this book follows a married couple, a newly married couple, and everything seems quite idyllic, but there is a little bit of a caveat where the wife asks the husband to not delve into her past and to not ask any questions, and he's happy enough to do that until they end up having to return back to her childhood home because her aunt is dying. And within this home for the husband, there is so much temptation and so much curiosity, and so many questions come up about his wife's past and how things have become how they are and how things have come to pass. So this story is a story that's mostly told from two perspectives. So from the husband's perspective, but also from his wife's childhood friend's perspective. I liked how that was done, how that was juxtaposed. So we're jumping between past and present in these two perspectives. It's full of secrets and myths and really uneasy magic. You never really know if things are real. It's one of those books where you're kind of like, I don't know what's happening, but I'm going to go with it. The writing is really the star of the show here. Roshni Chokshi's writing is very lush and gorgeous and lyrical and really drips with atmosphere. Like, this is one of these books that is just so atmospheric. The house itself feels almost like a character within this novel. There's a lot going on here. It's very much a dark sort of modern fairy tale. It's decadent and it's full of metaphors that blur the line between truth and fiction and reality and myth. I really enjoyed the immersive quality of this setting, and the sense of place here was palpable. It explores themes of love and obsession and and the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and about other people. This is a book that won't be for everybody. It's not incredibly plot driven. The pacing is slow and dreamy and sort of ornate, and sometimes the ornate writing really overshadows the plot, so you have to be prepared for that going into this book. I found myself definitely more enchanted by the atmosphere than fully invested in the characters, which made the eventual reveals again feel a little bit sort of lackluster for me and kind of predictable rather than shocking. But overall, it's a book that I did quite enjoy, and it gave me exactly what I was looking for when I picked up this book. And then the 9th and final book that I finished in August is a book by Kristen Hanna, and that book is The Women. So we follow Frankie McGrath, and she is a nurse and she enlists in the army during the Vietnam War to go over and to help. So the first sort of half of this book is about Frankie when she is in Vietnam and what happens there, the trauma and the relationship she forms within this environment and how difficult it is. And then the second half of the book is about when she comes back to America and how at the time these people who helped in the war effort were actually really heavily criticized and made to feel ashamed for going to Vietnam. So there's a lot in here about like propaganda and about Lyndon B. Johnson saying that they were winning the war when she was over there, and she was trying to patch together these people who had been blown up, so many American citizens, while America was saying actually everything's going great, we're having very few deaths and very few casualties, which of course was not the case. Kristen Hanna does a really great job in this of shining a light of a part of history that often goes untold, and frankly I know very little about the Vietnam War. It wasn't something I was exposed to much in history classes in school. The medical scenes in here are very visceral and gripping, and Frankie's experiences give the novel both urgency and heart, and I really appreciated how Hannah explored the long shadow of trauma and how veterans were abandoned by their country when they came home. At points this was a very difficult, very unsettling read, as you would imagine, because it's about war, but she does it really well. I definitely felt like the first half of the book where she was in Vietnam was probably stronger than the second half. While the story is incredibly powerful, it's also quite heavy-handed at times. Certain emotional beats felt a little bit like they were being repeated over and over to the point of losing subtlety, and some of the characters maybe fell into archetypes rather than feeling quite fully rounded. As I've mentioned, I didn't think the second half was as strong. I thought the pacing dipped and the post-war sections really did stretch on longer than needed. I thought this book was potentially a little bit too long, but overall it's definitely a moving book. Like, I cried quite a few times even though I saw things coming a mile away. It's readable and it's quite impactful, and it's a story that will resonate with many and shed light on a lot of different forgotten voices. For me, it was a compelling book. It's not a flawless book, but I'm glad that I read it, even if it didn't completely blow me away. And so pals, that is that. Those were the 9 books that I finished in August. A little bit of a mixed bag. No favourites yet again, but however we move. Let me know if you have read any of these books in the comments below, what you thought of them. Start up a little bit of a chat with me, and also let me know your favourite reads from August, or if you have any recommendations for me. Otherwise, if you want to leave a comment but you don't know quite what comment to leave, I'm so excited to be in September, so leave me a little autumnal emoji. Otherwise, do give this video a bit of a thumbs up if you want to see more from me, and of course subscribe if you want to. And as ever, thanks so much for watching, pals. Really appreciate it. Talk to you next week in another video. Bye bye.